When we imagine the Middle Ages, images of brave knights fearlessly devoting themselves to their beautiful ladies and wandering troubadours extolling noble love come to mind. We tend to drape this period in a veil of romance. But was it truly like that? In reality, the picture of medieval love was quite different, sharply contrasting with our modern perceptions. The Church's power in intimate relationships in the Middle Ages, the Church controlled every aspect of life, including the most personal details of intimate relationships between spouses. Sex was permitted solely for procreation. Women were often called lustful sows, and the wedding night frequently took place in front of numerous witnesses. Could a feudal lord exercise his right to the first night? What was the true nature of knightly love? Did they wear chastity belts? And is it true that humanity invented love and marriage as we know them today in the Middle Ages? Medieval eroticism. Unusual symbols of sexuality. Interestingly, the medieval understanding of eroticism also differed greatly from ours. Depictions of nude women were not considered erotic at all. Rather, bare bodies were seen as something asexual. The true symbols of sexuality were hair, the color of lips and face, and of course hands. Much time was dedicated to hand care, as they distinguished noble women from peasant women. Hand care. Today, be relax. Massagers. Fortunately, it's much easier to keep your hands in perfect condition today. For example, with Be Relax acupressure hand massagers. This wonderful massager will help you maintain youthful hands and more. If your fingers are numb, you have swelling, or suffer from cold hands syndrome, Be Relax is what you need. It's all about the active points on our hands. Stimulating them harmonizes the body's functions, so the massage is calming and even reduces appetite. Be Relax is also an ideal gift for elderly parents. This massager improves blood circulation and relieves pain from arthritis and arthrosis. It's suitable for rehabilitation after a stroke and for preventing hypotonia and carpal tunnel syndrome if you spend a lot of time at the computer. It also alleviates pain after sports training. You can purchase Be Relax on credit and test it out in the showroom in Moscow, Tulskaya metro station. Follow the link in the video description to learn more. Katrina in the Church, encountering medieval reality. So meet our heroine, Katrina. She lives in an unusual time, the Middle Ages, in a small French town. Lately, she has started noticing a handsome young neighbor, René, who can't take his eyes off her. Finally, the young man confessed his love. She, too, was not indifferent to him, but didn't know what to do. Who do you think a girl in the Middle Ages would go to for advice? No, not to her mother or a more experienced friend, but to a priest. Yes, you heard right. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church literally stuck its nose into all spheres of life, even excessively private ones. In the Middle Ages, the body was considered sinful, as was woman. She was perceived as the embodiment of original sin. In numerous treatises of that time, she is described as dirt, impurity, and the constantly open gate of hell. It was believed that woman lusted, and man was obliged to keep her on a short leash. Meanwhile, these treatises were written by monks, men who seemingly completely lacked such experience and constantly tried to curb their own passions. As a result, they created the image of woman as an insatiable lustful sow and a cruel she-wolf who should be hated. Woman provoked fear, distrust, and contempt. It was a popular view that she had no mind and knew not what she did. The church writer Jerome of Stridon strongly advised punishing wives and beating them. The ideal, of course, was virginity. But what about the continuation of the human race? The church reached a compromise. Sex was allowed only for spouses and solely for the purpose of procreation. And God forbid, not during the few church holidays. The church strictly controlled everything, right down to the recommended conjugal positions. Everything related to carnal love, relations between man and woman, was called fornication. If it weren't for the church, Sigmund Freud would have been jobless in the Middle Ages. Adultery and fornication were even punishable by death. But at the same time, the church often condoned prostitution as a necessary evil. In short, as Johann Huizinga wrote, in the Middle Ages, the scent of roses was mixed with the smell of blood. The rite of the first night in medieval weddings? But let's return to our heroine. The enamored young man, René, became increasingly persistent. But in response to his advances, the priest advised her to think about her immortal soul and avoid fornication. And then René offered her his hand and heart. It would seem, what more could a girl in the Middle Ages want? But was it worth getting married in that era? This is where our Katrina seriously began to ponder. In the Middle Ages, the seigneur, that is, the lord of the land where you lived, had the right to spend the first night with the bride of his serf. This was even considered a blessing. The young husband would do everything possible to thank the seigneur for such an honor with money or gifts. If the bride and groom did not want to observe the tradition, in some cases, they could buy off the lord, if they had the means, of course. Today, some historians consider the rite of the first night a popular myth that arose later. However, here is a historical document that indeed confirms that such a rite existed. A ruling by the arbitration court of King Ferdinand II the Catholic. We believe and declare that lords cannot, when a peasant marries, sleep the first night with his wife, and as a sign of their lordship on the wedding night, when the bride has gone to bed, step over the bed and over the aforementioned woman. Nor can lords use, against their will, the daughter or son of a peasant for payment or for free. And here is a document from 1507. If a subject, male or female, of the village of Druff marries and a wedding feast is held, the young spouse may spend the first night with his bride only if there is permission from the aforementioned lord, or if the aforementioned lord has already slept with the bride. The 19th century French writer Colin de Plancy even wrote that canons, i.e., clergymen of the St. Victor Cathedral in Marseille, were officially allowed to exercise the rite of the first night with their serf girls. He also cites facts of the sale of the rite of the first night by seigneurs to other lords. However, if you were lucky enough that no lord spoiled your first night, then a medieval-style wedding awaited you. I can tell you right away, nothing good there either. The first wedding night in front of numerous witnesses, entering the bridal bed in front of witnesses, wedding customs that persisted throughout the Middle Ages. In Scotland and England, guests would not leave until the bride undressed completely to confirm that she had no flaws. For kings, however, things were even worse. To confirm that the marriage had been consummated, up to 20 people were invited to the bridal bed, including the archbishop, witnesses, and even the groom's mother. Can you imagine? By the way, subscribe to our channel right now, or you'll miss our next videos where we'll talk about the lives of prostitutes in the Middle Ages. Believe me, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Don't forget to click the notification bell. Marriage in the Middle Ages, from polygamy to monogamy. And finally, when all is behind them, the marriage itself begins. By the way, there's a theory that the concept of marriage as we understand it was invented in the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, the familiar concept of family didn't exist in Europe yet. People, especially the nobility, lived in polygamous unions, changing wives one after another, and saw no problem with close kin relations. In short, times were harsh and crude. Moreover, no one had heard of the strict restrictions imposed by marriage. The Christian model of monogamous and indissoluble marriage emerged in Europe only in the 12th century, when the Church recognized marriage as one of the sacraments and began to protect it with all its might. Premarital and extramarital sexual relations were severely punished, sometimes with death or long penance in the Church. But among the clergy, Jerome's definition remained popular. He who loves his wife too ardently commits adultery. But under any circumstances, whether in marriage or outside of it, women at that time were completely powerless. Even in court, she could not defend herself, and all property she owned at the time of marriage went to her husband. The charter of the city of Villefranche in Gascony in the 13th century allowed every man to beat his wife, provided that she did not die from the blows. Divorces and infidelity, harsh punishments. And what about divorce in the Middle Ages? Divorce was something out of a fantasy. It wasn't customary, and few would dare, as the procedure was not very pleasant. Judge for yourself. The only reasons for divorce were either the death of one spouse or the husband's sexual dysfunction. But to prove her husband's incapacity, a wife had to invite priests and female neighbors as experts, and then sleep with him in front of them to demonstrate whether he could or not in the presence of a crowd. As a rule, the man was declared impotent. Of course, things were even worse in cases of infidelity. Premarital or extramarital affairs were severely punished. In Italy, a man caught in adultery faced castration, while a woman who cheated on her husband had her nose cut off and was publicly flogged. In France, punishments varied by province. In Paris, adultery as a serious criminal offense was punishable by death. In Orléans, adulterers were simply expelled from the city. But in Toulouse, a wife caught in adultery was confined to a monastery. The most original punishment, however, was in northern France. Those caught in adultery were forced to run naked through the entire city, with the promiscuous woman running ahead, holding a rope tied to her male companion. The whole town would gather to watch such a spectacle. Solving procreation problems and legal cases rapes were not uncommon. Girls rarely went to court back then. Nevertheless, one 9th century Italian court document tells a story of a certain Adalgisa who sued her rapist, Temilgard. He couldn't pay the required fine, so he and all his possessions became the full property of the victim. Oh, how? If a wife couldn't conceive, it was definitely grounds for divorce. But what if the man was unable to procreate? The Middle Ages found original answers to this question. If a husband was unable to conceive a child, a marriage helper would intervene. The unfortunate husband had to summon his neighbors and ask them to help his wife. Of course, he would become a victim of ridicule, contempt, and slander. Nevertheless, he was forced to participate in this process, since a woman could not, on her own initiative, go to a neighbor. That would be adultery, for which, as we know, in some places, death was the penalty. The invention of romantic love, courtly relations. It would seem that this was truly an era unsuitable for elevated feelings. However, despite all this, it was precisely in the Middle Ages that humanity invented romantic love. Courtly or polite love, one of the most significant achievements of the European Middle Ages. At a time when ladies were called lustful sows, the service to women suddenly flourished. In the late 11th century, several aristocrats and poets from southern France created a special world of feelings that would shape entirely new relationships between men and women in Western civilization. Now, simply fighting with neighbors and rubbing one's hands on tablecloths was no longer fashionable. Knights, in addition to tournaments and wars, were also expected to achieve romantic victories. And to gain fame, a knight had to win over a lady he admired. Unexpectedly, what were once crude bandits and boors began to acquire handkerchiefs, shave, wear elegant costumes, and practice the art of singing and dancing to earn the favor of ladies. Now, in love, the dominant position belonged to the woman. A knight had to love his married lady with all his heart and know that they would never have any other relationship. Such was this romantic, platonic love. Thanks to troubadours and chivalric romances, it spread throughout Europe, including its most remote corners. By the way, it was then that the familiar heart symbol first became a symbol of love. The main rules of true courtly love are set out in Andreas Capellanus's The Art of Courtly Love. The main rule in it is, marriage is no excuse for not loving. Moreover, during one of the courts of love, ladies ruled, true love is impossible in marriage, for marriage is compulsion. There were other rules too. Love, once divulged, rarely lasts. Love easily acquired is rarely valued. And love acquired with difficulty is exalted, or receiving anything from a lover against their will never leads to good. These rules form the basis of another specifically medieval invention, the courts of love at royal courts, where ladies themselves presided and passed judgment. Historian Henri Martin believes that the courts of love in the Middle Ages were uniquely structured. Love, which was equated with science and religion, received its own code of laws, its canonical law, so to speak, and female tribunals tried to apply this law just as the church applied its own. The chastity belt, myth or reality? Let's return to our Katrina. One fine day, the priest who had been supporting her in her fight against temptations informed her that he would have to go to Venice on urgent business. But he ordered our heroine to swear that in his absence, she would not succumb to her weakness. She promised to be firm, but on the condition that the priest would bring her a mirror. And in those days, Venice was famous for its mirrors, and Katrina so desperately wanted to see her beautiful face in one. What did spouses in the Middle Ages do when they went away and didn't quite trust their wives? Did they install surveillance cameras? No, they bought a chastity belt and literally locked their ladies up. This is one of the most piquant stories of the Middle Ages. Cases were not uncommon when a husband left his home for a long time, and his wife in such a situation had to have the belt removed with the help of master blacksmiths, witnesses, and church representatives. These belts are on display in many European museums, but from a medical point of view, wearing them is questionable. The heavy metal would cause abrasions and wounds that would fester and lead to fatal blood poisoning. But then what about the chastity belts exhibited in many European museums? Well, modern historians are convinced that these are actually fakes from the Victorian era. A major scandal erupted in the 1990s when staff at major museums, the British Museum and the Musée National du Moyen Âge in Paris, conducted examinations and found that the supposedly medieval artifacts were manufactured in the mid-19th century. Now, the British Museum catalogue states, "It is probable that most of the items now known were manufactured in the 18th and 19th centuries as fetish objects for the obsessed or as jokes. Serious museums hasten to remove the questionable artifacts to their storerooms." The Church and Spiritual Union, from severity to reality. As for our beautiful Katrina, despite her romantic feelings for Renee, she managed to resist all temptations, even without a chastity belt. She so desperately wanted to get that Venetian mirror. Finally, the priest returned. She proudly told him that she had managed to avoid the weakness of the flesh, even though the young man had been persistent and showered her with gifts. The priest remained silent. Then Katrina couldn't help but ask him, "And the mirror?" To her horror, she saw what he had brought her. So the church categorically disapproved of sex. It was considered something shameful, a repetition of original sin. You might say, well, what about husband and wife then? Here's how: a spiritual union, an example of which was cited in the 6th century by Bishop Gregory of Tours. A young couple lived their entire lives together, resting on the same bed and preserving a praiseworthy innocence. But at that rate, humanity would simply die out. Here's an instruction from the Catholic Church. Of course, all this was permitted only for the conception of a child. Embraces were allowed, but confession was recommended before and after coitus. Unsuccessful attempts to conceive a child were considered a real sin, although women suffered much more for these sins than men. Talking about sex was only allowed during confession. Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury, who lived in the 7th century, forbade husbands from seeing their wives naked. The Church's stance on homosexual relationships was also unequivocal. It was considered unnatural and a God-forbidden activity, and offenders were subjected to severe punishment and deprived of life. In the 12th century, they were burned, subjected to various tortures to cast out demons and atone for sins. Nevertheless, there is evidence that monarchs and nobles often engaged in homosexual relationships. For example, it is suspected that the famous King Richard the Lionheart had a relationship with his brother at the time of his marriage to his chosen one. Monasteries and brothels, the church and prostitution. In every medieval city, there was a brothel. They were mostly called women's houses back then. Their necessity was not disputed by anyone, including the church, as they were intended not only to protect respectable girls and women, but also to supervise immorality. And how do you imagine a medieval women's monastery? Quiet nuns praying in cold cathedrals? Well, no. In the Middle Ages, there were special types of monasteries that were no different from brothels. In this way, the church tried to control prostitutes. For example, a monastery in Avignon, in the south of France, was founded in the 14th century precisely to conquer prostitution. All the ladies of pleasure were gathered, not to re-educate them, but so that they would offer their services under the control of the church. They were locked up around the clock, and the monastery doors were opened only at the discretion of the abbess. She selected clients as she saw fit. Visitors were strictly warned to be quiet and not cause trouble, and not to harm the ladies of pleasure. At the slightest cause for complaint, a client could be seized and imprisoned in a tower. But the most important injunction stated that the monastic ladies had to undergo an examination by the abbess and a doctor every Saturday. Moreover, such a house of pleasure was indeed called a monastery. It was under the patronage of the Order of St. Mary Magdalene. True form and freedom of choice. But what about our heroine? We left her at the moment when the priest took out an object from the folds of his cassock that startled her. It was a skull. He cynically held it up to the young woman's face and said, Behold, vain woman, this is your true form. Think, for you will die, and before God, you are nothing." Our Katrina shuddered in horror, and that very night, she gave herself to her beloved. From then on, she enjoyed his company, indulging in the joys of love. This is how a true medieval story, which we have simply retold to you, goes.